Hey, what's going on? It's time for Reasons Why Aliens Would Never Invade Earth. And as you know, I have been studying human behavior for years. For years, I've been studying it on a real life term, out there looking for people doing bad stuff. And you know how it is when you're out there searching for bad behavior. But I have a guest who actually studied it. He has a PhD in human behavior. And we kind of come together and realize, and we've come to one important conclusion, and that is Earth will never be invaded by aliens simply because of the behavior. And some of the things we're going to talk about is culture wars. And I want to bring on here Adrian McIntyre, and he has a PhD in cultural anthropologist, which is a big word for what?
Well, so anthropology. And, we like to say, anything that's an ology is the study of. So this is anthropos plus ology. What's anthropos? It's a fancy Latin way of saying the human thing. And one of the interesting things about anthropology as a discipline is anthropologists are probably some of the most vexed of the social scientists because we are also the subject of being human as well as the object of study. And we get ourselves twisted up in humans being human, talking about humanity. But it's a really delightful way if you're somebody who's as kind of chaotic as I am of not having to do any one specific thing because, it's humans.
Well, what's funny thing about humans is we are a interesting species. I mean, I hate to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway. We're kind of parasitic. We kind of get into things and we just obliterate it until we run out of resources, and then we go, okay, how can we fix it? But sometimes we get to the point where we can't fix it. Like the white rhino we've pretty much taken that to extinction.
Yeah. There's this fascinating thing to me about human beings, and that is, as near as I can tell, in the animal kingdom, we are the only ones enamored of our own uniqueness and specialness. We are the animals running around telling every other animal on Earth that we're the top of the food chain, that we're the most significant thing that's ever happened to our planet, that we are the apex predator in all these ways, yeah. Right? And yet you look at what we're doing out here, and it's phenomenally nonsensical at some level. And so, we got ourselves twisted up in all of these really interesting and weird kind of justifications for our own existence. And then you start to layer in the things that we make with language, like religion, politics, art, science, and all the rest. And we've gotten ourselves locked into a pretty interesting place where we don't have the answers, and we've kind of run out, a lot of us anyway, of good questions. And so we sort of just run around like drinking 64 ounces of, Coke and calling it a day. Like we're at this really funny spot in the evolution of a species.
I agree. And when you brought up drinks, the first thing that came to my mind is that if you drink 32 ounces of beer, you were kind of like you're a, what's the word I'm looking for? A millennial, you're doing good things if you do 32 ounces of beer. I'm going to have a 32 ounce of Pabst Blue Ribbon. But if I go out in the store and go, can I get a 40 ounce of Pabst Blue Ribbon? All of a sudden I'm hood.
Yes, because the difference between 32 ounces and 40 ounces is the difference between ghetto and white supremacy. You see?
Oh,
I don't know. Look, we get ourselves into some
popping up in my podcast. That's not the first time I've heard that.
Which word?
White supremacy.
Well, actually, that's two words. Just saying.
Listen, here's why. Because quite honestly, I let me say this for context. First of all, there's a couple of things. I'm super pumped to be here with you, Stanley, because I've known your work for years. Used to live in the Bay Area. Used to see you on Cron 4 and all the rest. And when I saw that you were doing this show, I'm like, oh, that's such a perfect extension of, the Caught Misbehaving series, because some way you love humans, and
I do,
and you are a constant observer of our shortcomings, but you do it with such love. I mean, so I appreciate the chance to be here. Some of what I'm going to say is going to sound like it's a downer, but actually I kind of have a similar vibe, although I wouldn't, I don't have the same stature in the world. And that is, I am I am fascinated by the ways in which we talk to ourselves about ourselves.
Oh, absolutely.
The ways, and I mean that as individuals, what the the very white self-help movement called self-talk, but also I mean like as a species, like the stories we tell ourselves, about our place in the universe, about how for so many years of human history we were perfectly okay thinking the entire known universe was revolving around us. We saw no cognitive problem with that whatsoever because it made perfect
Right.
sense. We're supreme, except for that, God character that we write about in our own languages, in our own books and whatnot, So we get
I
ourselves
agree.
in this funny place. And that's why things like language have to be taken seriously because they're never separate from
Okay.
power relations. One of the things about human beings is like, look, we're pack animals. Okay. So I don't want to be overly simplistic, but just like dogs are trying to figure out like who's the top of the heap, who's alpha, and so they go around sniffing each other and figuring that out in the way that they do. We have a similar thing. We're a hierarchical animal, and we like to put ourselves in certain places. But historically, it's not controversial to say that the folks now called white have played that game in a particular way with regard to everyone else on Earth, including the game of the scientific justification for
I've heard
racist
that.
policies, including the game of religious and moral superiority is like, well, we need to, civilize these savages. I mean, it's just when you get under the surface of it, we get into some pretty fundamental problems with the way we're doing it out here. We being humans, but yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say specifically white folks need to take this extra seriously because whether we like it or not, we are benefiting from a system that has been skewed in our favor. And that's not something I'm interested in carrying forward, although that is what got us to this point.
Well, I mean, if you look at the facts of history, I mean, the slaves helped build the White House. The Chinese culture helped build the rail system that we know today, that we all use on a regular basis to get our product from point A to point B. Different, and even when we quote unquote discovered America, which I still have a problem with. How do you discover something, but there's somebody waving at you? It's like that's like me going into a cheeseburger and beer and go, I just found this place, therefore I'm going to name it Stanley.
Yes,
and
I will call it. I will plant my flag, and forevermore, the Yelp reviews will be known as Stanley's.
Yes.
Meanwhile, Ricardo's
Stanley's
is like,
forever.
"Hey, man, I was here. What are you talking about? This is I run the kitchen. Who Stanley? What?"
And I will go to court and fight you over that fact.
So you mentioned history and quote unquote discovering America. A lot of times when I'm talking about this subject, it's in a more formal setting than this one. So I appreciate the very kind of wide-ranging, relaxed nature of this conversation. But I always found fascinating a wonderful point that was made by James Llewellyn, who's a sociologist who's written a lot about history. So sociologist writing about history and the way history gets told. His most famous book was called Lies My Teacher Told Me. Everything your American history textbook got wrong. He makes a wonderful point early on in that book, which is this. How you know that history is skewed, American history in particular in this case, is that every history textbook that you've used in school starts the story of America on the East Coast. Plymouth Rock, the Pilgrims, all that stuff. When in fact, the story of human settlement on this continent started 10,000 years earlier on the West Coast. Human civilization settlement, began on the West Coast and spread eastward. But yet the stories we've told, we meaning white historians, Eurocentric historians, nationalist historians, have always started with our own arrival, right? Like, we're here, the story can begin now.
So who actually showed up on the West Coast?
Well, so the earliest humans to arrive in North America, there's still some debate about exactly did they walk across the Bering Strait land bridge, but the receding of the Ice Age, the end of the Pleistocene, or in fact were there boat cultures in northeastern Asia that then spread westward eastward from there. The world is round, so it kind of depends on where you are. Spread further east from where they were and landed on the west coast. I don't know. That's not the specific area of my specialization, but
okay, we won't go deeper into that.
It does remind us that, the old saying is history is written by the conquerors is literally true. How do I know? Your high school history book told you the story starting on the East Coast, which is where the Europeans arrived. I came to the show with a couple of things that I thought would be fun to talk about, but you also had something you said, I can't do a show with this week without talking about this issue in San Francisco. Do you want to address that before we get off into the weeds and anthro land?
Yeah, so I guess there was some video shot by a reporter at ABC7 that showed a gentleman on a bicycle, and I sent you the video so you could see it, who was stealing from the store, shoplifting. We use that name. I guess it's not considered stealing if it's shoplifting. And he just drove out, and some of the questions were raised as to why is this allowed to go on.
You see the video, and I think this is a great example for us to talk about some of these higher level issues, problems with humans, because the first thing is, what do you see when you watch this video? Do you see a black guy on a bicycle stealing? And is that the focus of your attention? Or do you see a bunch of folks with cell phones recording the guy? Is that the focus of your attention? Do you see the security guard employed by the store not doing anything until the guy tries to ride past and he tries to grab the trash bag full of stuff off, and then the guy gets away with the stuff? Is that what you see? So whatever bothers you about the video, and you meaning y'all, everyone.
Yeah, I know.
Whatever bothers us is kind of interesting way into this problem, because either you're going to say, it's terrible, homeless people are just stealing us blind from stores, or you're going to say, it's terrible, everyone's just standing around filming like for their TikTok, or you're going to say, it's terrible, the security guard is paid. And then someone else is going to be like, no, he isn't paid that much. Like, he's not messing with the guy because they got insurance. I think it's a fascinating example of how what you see and what bothers you about what you see says more about you than what's happening in the video. Although I think there's a lot of issues in the video that ought to get talked about. Thoughts?
So you're right. And so if you listen to the thread, because the thread went on forever, I reposted the Channel 7 video on my Twitter and gave people a chance to comment on what they saw. And the interesting part about it is that you got all different facets of who did what I did and who didn't do what. And the fact is that there has been a systemic problem with shoplifting to the point where they're stealing up to $950 worth of merchandise at one time. Why that number? Because under the new guidelines for Prop 47, which isn't actually new, you can only be charged with a misdemeanor if it's under $950 if you haven't been charged with a crime before. So they're going in and bagging up stuff. And yeah, they're not standing with a calculator going, this. But in some cases, there are people who say that they actually come in there and calculate how much stuff they need to do before they get to that number, so that if they do get stopped with it, it's just a misdemeanor. So then the other cases, people go, why is the guard just standing there? And then people tell you that the guard, it's been told to not interact. They can only watch and observe. And so everybody pulls out their phones and records it for prosperity or to post it out there. So what do we do? We're in a situation where, and San Francisco is a good litmus test for the rest of society. But in Seattle, and I believe Portland, these three cities are having the same issue, which then takes us to a different realm, because some people claim politics. So there's so many different facets of who's at fault, what can be done, how to fix it. But guess what? None of it's being fixed.
Right. So one of the things that's fascinating is, depending on how you define the problem, shapes what solutions seem possible, right? So do you define the problem as criminality? Then you're looking for a law enforcement solution, right? If you define the problem as politics, and I assume they mean municipal politics, but you never know these days. People will call politics about anything, but really, we're talking about mayors, city council level. I assume politics, board of soups, whatever.
Non-partisan.
Then you right,
or bipartisan.
Then you're looking at it at that level, right? If you define the problem as income inequality that has created huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots, then you'd be looking at it at that level. If you define the problem as homelessness, and if you think homelessness is a moral failure on the part of the homeless, right, then you're going to look at it through that lens. Like, well, these people should really just pull themselves together. If you define it's very much like addiction, right? If you talk to anybody who's been actively involved in recovery movements of a more recent variety than 100-year-old 12-step thing, which is valid. So I'm not dismissing that. I'm just saying the more recent evolution, like recovery 2.0, if you will. Everyone who's involved in this will tell you that addiction for the addict is a solution to a problem, and that problem is pain in their life. And so instead of asking why the addiction, we should be asking why the pain. Now, that's a very compassionate kind of, person-centered look at something. There's a lot of folks that don't view addiction that way. They view addiction as a morally degenerate action of somebody who's weak and lazy, right? Well, problem is, if you view it that way, then the only solution you have to addiction is punishment, right? So like, we got to be careful about how we define the problem. So in the case of this video, it's a great example because there's so many intersecting issues here, right? Is the problem homelessness? Is the problem inequality? Is the problem a failure of law enforcement? Is the problem a failure of corporations to properly, set up their physical shop or train their employees? Is the how you define the problem shapes what solutions you think are possible.
Okay. Fair enough.
And other people define the problem differently. So what? I say, look at the income inequality, and somebody else says, look at the reason why we have to have barbed wire and machine guns in front of the Walgreens or whatever.
Okay, fair enough. I agree with that. So let's switch gears now. Let's look at culture wars.
Yeah.
And there is a culture war going on right now.
This is something that's really important to me because if I try to, there's a lot of specific issues, right? We could look at any number of places from, elections to COVID response to electricity, utility. You could look at anything and there's a lot of stuff broken everywhere, right? And again, how you define the problem depends a lot. What solutions you think are possible depends on how you define the problem. So I began to think about why are we in the midst of we face these problems, these challenges together, right? Global warming, you could debate it or not debate it. It's not going to matter actually because reality has an advantage in this argument. Like at some point, reality is going to be inarguable with. For many people, it already is. I was trying to understand, why do we spend so much time frothing at the mouth and getting upset with each other?
Oh, it's kind of become the way to make people rich nowadays.
Some people, and this is the thing that I wanted to talk about. I think, so I live here in northern Phoenix. Most of my neighbors don't think like I think about pretty much anything. And yet they're good people trying to take care of their own, make it in life, do good work to the extent they are. That not everybody. Got my eye on you, buddy. 2 houses down. And yet, if we were to sit around and without the influence of toxic political rhetoric or whatever, just talk about our lives, what we want, what we're afraid of, what we've struggled with, things we've overcome, whatever. My contention is we'd find a lot more in common than if they start, mudslinging, liberal, blah, 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 whatever. And I, having lived and worked all over the world, I've seen this literally everywhere. The more people just connect and talk about what they have in common, the more we realize how much that other stuff that used to really upset us is to use another fancy word, epiphenomenal. In other words, it's not the thing. It's like it is a phenomenon, but it's not the main one. So I started thinking about the culture wars. And depending on how you track this and whose history you're reading, I'm fascinated by the fact that somewhere in the mid to late 80s, somewhere in the Reagan years, the media, which was a different animal back then than it is today. We should talk about that. You know, you've been in broadcast journalism for a really long time. I grew up in a radio station, so I've, been around radio since I was 5. The media became a place where these things were being fought out. And the part that I think my neighbors don't always realize is that there is a business model around making money with your outrage.
Yep, there is. I mean,
so we ought to talk about that. I think as people, we ought to be able to say, okay, wait a minute. They want me to not like you. I wonder why.
And they'll pay you for that.
They'll pay you for that, and they'll get paid for that. They'll get paid in clicks that drive advertiser rates. They'll get paid in sponsorships. Certain cable networks will get paid by negotiating a much higher per user fee so that they're a little bit more insulated from market dynamics. I'm not going to name any names, but the initials are Fox News. They make listen, whether you watch them or don't watch them, listen, I want you to know they have done a better job than the other cable networks of making sure they get paid no matter what. So at one hand, kudos to being a savvy, negotiator. On the other hand, they can say some stuff then and not have advertisers bailing on them, which does happen sometimes.
It does happen.
Not have that affect their core business because they've insulated themselves from it. Fine. These are just facts. I mean,
so remember, I think, and tell me if I'm wrong, the guy who started this whole thing with the whole rage on TV and on the radio, but his was on social media at first, and then he went to TV, and it could be somebody before him, but the initials are Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah.
Limbaugh.
So Rush is important, and actually, I'm glad you brought him up because I grew up in Southern California, major market, LA radio, like that. This is where Rush was syndicated there. Obviously, wasn't broadcasting out of there necessarily, but I remember the first time I heard Rush on the radio. I had graduated high school in 1991. I had a summer job working for the guy who used to be the science teacher at my high school, but he quit and started his own company doing science shows in malls. Remember malls?
Yes, I know. Yeah, those things are very rare now, but yeah, you still have them.
By the way, side note, this was a huge eye-opener to me. So I'm 18 years old and driving a truck for Rob Schultz. Shout out to Mr. Schultz if you're out there somewhere. I still think about you. And what we used to do was he had all these exhibits that we would take to the malls and set them up. And I never knew this before, but malls, this is kind of irrelevant now that every mall around is closing, but the outer doors of malls were never locked. It's just the inner doors that with the gates that would come down over all the shops. Those were all closed. So we would show up at the malls of LA and South Central LA, Watts, Englewood, Hawthorne, whatever. We were going to places where science education in those school districts was less well funded. And so what would happen is we would put these exhibits in the malls, and then they would bus students in the daytime on like science trips, and they would go and we would do all this stuff. My job wasn't to do anything other than I was manual labor. And so I would drive these trucks in and set them up or whatever. And I just remember one morning we were going to work, and he says, "Hey, you listen to Rush Limbaugh?" And I'm like, "I don't know who that is." And he was like, "Oh, you got to check this out. Listen to this guy." And I remember, it was a long form conversation. Well, rant, really. It was one-sided. And it was just talking about stuff. And I remember hearing for the first time, although I didn't understand the significance of it then, this kind of rhetoric of us versus them.
Yep, that's when it started.
And that really evolved over the years to, and developed its own private language about, I hesitate to even repeat the hideous things, but like the feminazis and it evolved into like the Democrat Party. Why people can't even pronounce the name of a party is beyond me. But anyway, and I ought to add another layer to this, because Rush was doing this with a primarily secular framework.
Yes. He had a small group too of people.
But there's another. That's right, and it grew. Like it was a voice. It was a voice of clarity. I mean, look, Rush is a brilliant guy. He's a good talker. He's a sharp dude. Was anyway. Rest in painful agony. No. So I'm going to alienate some folks here. Sorry, but I think he did a real disservice, because what I don't think people realized was, as gruesome as the Civil War was between 1861 and 1865, right? As many American lives were lost in this horrific battle, the likes of which we have never before seen in terms of its shockingly gruesome consequences, physical violence, like the kind of death that you used to die on a battlefield of that era is just mind-boggling. Like, we won't dwell on it.
Okay.
It's the same kind of thing, by the way, that had a Swiss businessman named Henri Dunant was trying to get, this is in Europe, he was trying to get a concession for his business from the emperor, the Archduke, I don't remember, I'm not a European historian, sorry folks. And so he was traveling to try to get the big dog to sign this piece of paper saying he had the right to do business in some place. Capitalist dude. And it was on the battlefield, and I'm forgetting. I used to know because I used to work in humanitarian relief. We used to talk about this stuff. So on the battlefield, it starts with an S. It's an Italian battlefield, and he just saw the carnage. He saw people that had been mortally wounded 2 days before, and were just lying there dying in agony and misery, in blood and muck and guts and flies and stink. I mean, by the way, if you glorify war, chances are pretty good you haven't been very close to one.
Exactly.
Ask any combat vet who's actually seen what it's like, and you will not find folks running around in their, tactical cosplay, camo, special forces stuff. You'll find folks who have a very, very grim understanding of the reality of war and what humans are capable of doing. But I digress. Henri Dunant sees all of this and he says, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. Goes back and founds the Red Cross movement. Basically says, we got to do something about this. Changed everything.
Interesting. I just learned something today.
So in this country, we had one of those horrible wars on our own soil. We've had a lot of other horrible wars, but they've been farther away. So they've been mediated. We only see on the news. Unless you go to the VA, then you could see it up close.
Of course.
So what I don't think people realize is that another civil war started in this country in the late 80s, early 90s, and it started on the radio. And it started to create the same kind of rhetoric, this us versus them.
Yep.
And you know what? I don't want to be overly dramatic about this, but it's the same thing that happened in Rwanda with radio stories about the cockroaches and like those people, the Hutus and Tutsis and all the rest. Like, we have to deal with this problem. And I think most of us are so caught up in it that we don't see what's actually happening.
So that makes me think about something. And the new catchphrase for right now, and I'm going to go backwards after I say the catchphrase, because if you're listening, it's going to upset people. Black Lives Matters. Now, before somebody jumps in my throat and says, wait, what do you have against Black Lives Matters? Here's what my take is. A while back, when I lived in California, I used to watch on the news how they would say Black Lives Matters were protesting something. But then there were some radio people who were kind of like on the same tier as Rush. And I can't even think of the guy's name right now, but he had another big following where he just kind of went out there and said stuff to upset people. So there was some looting somewhere in some other city. I can't remember the city it was. And he quickly said, look at all these Black Lives Matters people looting. And I took offense to that. So I went on to his platform, which was probably the biggest mistake of my life, and I wrote, "It's not fair to call everybody because they're Black Lives Matters. It's just not fair because that's a movement, not a group of individuals. That's in my opinion. So for you to say that those people are Black Lives Matters to me this is how I felt in my mind. Now I typed it out and it sounded legit to me in my head, but I posted it and my response to him, because I thought, come on, dude, you can do better than this, right? And I took a nap. Well, when I woke up from my nap, my Twitter was on fire. There was so many comments. Now, these are comments from people who are regular followers of me, also followed this gentleman. And their comments weren't, hey, I understand, Stanley, what you're trying to say. I get it. Their response was, you ready for this? That's why you're never going to make it in this business. Your show's going to die a burning, flaming because of your. And all I was trying to say was, it's disingenuous to call Black people Black Lives Matters simply because they are Black. And that was my whole point. So I had to go back in and say that, which I thought I had said it before, but I had to clarify it. And then all the hate went away. But the funny part is I lost viewers because they thought I was against this guy, which I could care less who the guy is. But the backlash from me responding to him, who had built this following of just, in my opinion, people who just had an unrealistic view of things. And a lot of times it's an unrealistic view. You and I both study human behavior. We kind of get an idea of what we consider to be unrealistic human behavior. But there are people who believe that unrealistic behavior is fact. Case in point, today, there was on Snopes, and is it called Snopes? Snopes?
Yeah.
Snopes. There's an actual thing on Snopes right now that shows pictures of the second inaugural of Donald J. Trump. And it had Kid Rock and some other performer on these tickets. And they're selling the tickets online for this inauguration that's supposed to take place in August. And I'm like, what is going on?
So this question, what is going on? And let me just, I think that's the right question to ask. And I really want all of our friends and neighbors, regardless of whether you like what we're saying, hate what we're saying, think, I'm some commie pinko freak, whatever, think Stanley walks on water and turns water into wine or whatever you think.
If I did that, I'd be the richest man in the world.
I'd be over for dinner more often. Yeah.
I'd be with E40 making wine, just.
Is that what we have to pause? And this is, I'm about to ask humans to do something that is somewhat antithetical to our self-interest. And I'll tell you what I mean. We have to stop and think. Now, I want to say this without, it's probably unavoidable that I'm going to come across sounding elitist. I really don't mean it this way. I want to try to express something a little bit more nuanced, a little bit more complicated. Thinking is essential, and thinking is expensive biologically. So here's what I mean. Your brain is about 2 or 3% of your body by mass, but consumes more than 20% of your resources. So when we talk about things like brain food, right? That's actually a real thing. Like your brain has glycogen stored within it, just like your muscles have glycogen stored within them. And it has to convert that glycogen to glucose in order to do its processing. And that is metabolically expensive. So we have, in our very evolved sophistication, we have some pretty complicated ways of doing pretty simple stuff, right? So one of the things is we have evolved so many ways to not have to think. And at some level, that's okay because it allows us to cruise, right? So, but it's also deeply problematic because it opens us up to manipulation. Okay, so let me say what I mean about that. We can cruise because already having a preconceived idea about something uses less actual metabolic resources. So I'm talking about biological, money in the biological bank. It's cheaper to make assumptions than it is to think it through. It's fascinating how, people will say, oh, well, we got to get rid of stereotypes and prejudices. I'm sorry, you're not going to. You cannot, because biologically hardwired into the way that we are these shortcuts, these heuristics. We need to be able to make a snap decision without processing all the raw information, right? So evolutionarily, we need to hear a little noise in the bushes and be running before we see the full image of the saber-toothed tiger, right? We got to already be moving, or we're dinner and we're done as far as, our contribution to the species goes, right? I'm being a little glib and kind of summarizing some stuff, but not thinking is efficient, and efficiency is important biologically. Not thinking is also deeply problematic, because it means that if we never question ourselves and others, we end up being easily manipulated, especially in an era of mass media, mass consumption and whatnot. If you go back to those earliest settlers we were talking about, and I would never put earlier human groups on a pedestal. Like, there's nothing inherently better about that. Like, I like going to the dentist. That's a nice evolution. I prefer not to have medieval treatments if I had a problem. I don't want the cutting and the burning and the leeches and the pouring junk down. No, thank you.
What? You don't like that? I love that stuff.
Yeah, the great thing is in Scottsdale, you can get that stuff. That's all available. Yes. it's very expensive these days, but our neo-medievalists are there for you, the Wiccans and all the rest. Love you guys. Don't hate. Okay, so here's the problem. We actually like not having to think. So when someone comes along and tells us, well, let me break it down for you. These people good, those people bad. These people like you, superior. Those people not like you, inferior, right? Whatever categories those are, whether they're racial, political, ethnic, national, whatever, we're like, okay, great. Now I know. So now I know who to like. Now I know who to hate. What we don't realize is the people doing that make a lot of money by making us angry and scared. Angry about those people, scared of those people. And this happens across the spectrum. So please don't think this is a my team versus your team kind of a thing. In fact, even the idea that there are teams and somehow it's us against them, and which, we saw an enormous amount of during the Trump presidency from both sides. I mean, it really, in a way, just clarified what was already going on by making those divisions so much sharper. And, we love to blame. So number one, we don't like to think. It's less efficient to think. Thinking is hard. It makes our heads hurt. We need to actually eat calories in order to do it. But also, we like not being responsible. It's much easier in life if everything is somebody else's fault. So when someone comes along, as began on the radio and has extended into every aspect of our life, and said, those people, they're not like you. They want to take away what you have. They're coming for your money, guns, daughters, whatever.
That's always been the big thing: guns and money, and
and daughters. I have 2 sons, but it was like was being said before the 2016 election. We had an interesting moment where 2 populist candidates were vying for the ticket in their parties: Trump in the Republican Party and Bernie Sanders in the Democratic Party. Things worked out better politically for one than the other in that election. And we can talk about that, but that's a whole separate podcast. The interesting thing was they were diagnosing the problem in a similar way. It's just where they were assigning blame was different. So if you agreed that life was unfair and you were getting the short end of the stick, but you thought the reason was Mexicans and Muslims, you were going to vote one way. If you agreed that life was unfair and you were getting the short end of the stick, but you thought the problem was big corporations, media, and special interests, you were going to vote another way. Again, remember, how you define the problem shapes what you think the solution is.
What you think.
So my question then was, all right, so we got these culture wars, and let's be clear what we're talking about. People telling you that kind of art is bad and is going to undermine civilization, whether it's a crucifix floating in a jar of liquid. There was a very an Andres Serrano piece of art that will probably offend everybody if I say the name of it, so I better go ahead and do it. There was an installation, and the sign at the bottom said, "Piss Christ." And what it was a crucifix floating in a jar of amber liquid. Now, whether that was actual urine or not is unknown, but in any case, people were deeply, deeply offended by this. And this was like 1989. This was early days. There was no Facebook, Twitter, like, whatever to be outraged on. Like, you had to do it in the newspaper and on the radio, right? Old school. Something like Robert Mapplethorpe, a gay artist, photographer, wants to put on an exhibition, I think in Ohio, Cincinnati or something, roughly same time frame. And that museum was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts. So what do? We got our pitchforks and torches, and we said, no funding for queer art, although queer was too hip a term. We didn't use it back then. Then along comes the pundits who are telling us that the other party in our two-party political system, and I know there's more than two, thank you. There's only two that actually have any significant chance. And until we change ranked choice voting, everyone, what? Until we change it, we're stuck. We got two, okay? Two actual, practical, real options.
Right.
As long as someone's telling us it's the other team that's the problem, then we're ending up in the same
always be the problem
situation. And here's what I've been thinking about, and this is what I wanted to talk to you about. We got to understand that some people are in that business. And maybe we're okay with that. Maybe we're not. I don't know. But I think we should at least talk about it. I've had a couple of people on my own show recently that were clearly in the business of partisanship. And I could tell from their bio, like before they came on the show, that these were people who were writing books and giving speeches and doing media appearances on very particularly narrow platforms because their message appealed to that audience. And this takes us in, and again, without throwing everyone, I don't want to say we can't pay any attention to these folk. We should take them seriously, but we got to understand what's going on with the Dinesh D'Souza's and Ann Coulter's and others. Others. I just mentioned two old ones because it's a little safer to talk about the first wave of these folks. Candace Owens and others, right? We got to talk about the fact that these are folks, love them or hate them, that's fine. Take them seriously, dismiss them, that's sort of fine. I think we should take everybody seriously. Their business model is preaching to their choir. And on my side of the aisle, we have our own versions of this, right? But if that's the only message that's getting through, and that's what's shaping my emotions, it's a little bit like the situation with industrial food, where you have these food scientists. Remember this book that came out a couple years ago where somebody who had worked in the food industry for like 20 years basically came out and admitted that there's these three things, saltiness, sweetness, and fat, like the taste of fat. And
fast food wars?
Maybe. I don't remember. But basically that the industrial food scientists are trying to design foods that have the maximum possible amount of each of those three. Because if you get too far over the top, it becomes gross. But they're looking for that sweet spot with the most salt, sweet, and fat to get you hooked so you'll buy more. The same thing is happening with messaging, right? We don't have, that's not true. We have outright fascists. We have them here in the Valley. We have them everywhere. Like there are actual Nazis running around with hateful Nazi rhetoric. So those people need to be dealt with. I think the way Woody Allen, who is appropriately criticized for all kinds of things, but he did say something clever. I think we should defend the KKK's right to march and then go down and meet them with baseball bats. That's always seemed to me to be a nice balance between free speech and free action. Anyway.
Wow.
So I am worried about the actual Nazis. Anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism in this country, all of the things, right? Those are real problems. But I am worried about the sneak attack that's been building quietly and colonizing the minds of ordinary
It is working
folks.
that way up. Yep.
And it's not just that, and I want to be really clear about this part. It's not just them, the ultra-right, or them, the ultra-left, or them, the communists, or them, the democratic socialists, or them, the whoever's. This is what's happening everywhere. And I want ordinary people to just hold up for a second and go, wait a minute. This is going to take some effort. And I may not know exactly where to get my information because I'm so plugged in to these very biased sources, regardless of which side. But maybe we should just think for a minute. Maybe we should just talk to somebody for a minute. But it's easier to be scared and angry. So
why is it so hard to be a logical thinker? I consider myself to be a person who uses logic. You sound like a person that uses logic, but logic nowadays it's almost like trying to find that box of raisin total. They don't exist that much anymore.
It's like trying to find raisins on a Southwest Airlines flight. That's you have to be OG with Southwest to know. You used to be able to get raisins if you asked for them. Now you can't get anything, definitely not peanuts. Diane's in the chat saying logic is too hard. People don't like to think. I think Diane's right, but I would say this. I'm less, although I'm a big nerd, PhD, that doesn't make me smart, by the way. That means I spent a lot of money on 3 letters that don't actually have much bearing in real life. I think that beyond logic, what I really, really want for folks is experience, like actual encounters with people. I don't think you can be as scared and angry and resentful if you spend time talking to folks. I really don't. I think go ahead.
That's our problem, though, is that we don't talk anymore. I've had people that I've actually reached out to, and they want to send you a message by text message, but then you say, "Hey, can we talk on the phone?" Oh, wait a minute. You want to talk in real life? I don't talk on the phone. You have to text me. What the hell?
Well, now you're one step short of get off my lawn. And I mean, I appreciate where you're going with this. But I also got to say, we can't put any one type of communication on a pedestal. And we love to. I do the same thing. I prefer, good face-to-face conversation. Now that we're heading towards the other side of COVID, I'm looking forward to getting back to that again. I say that knowing that a lot of the world is not on the other side of anything yet. And even here, although I see the signs driving around Arizona, 6.2 million doses. Well, that's like 3 million people. That's like barely Maricopa County. Like we're not quite there, and we're in a rush to get back. But let me say this: I
think
a
big number.
I wouldn't put the channel, the medium, as they used to say in communication theory, right? I wouldn't put the medium on a pedestal, right? I would put the quality of the exchange on a pedestal. And so circling back to something that you said about, the Black Lives Matter moment and your Twitter post and everything blows up and everyone's coming for you. I actually think there's something valuable in that moment because we love the dog pile. We all, jump on, Stanley. But it's interesting the way you said it. And I can agree or disagree with what you wrote. I can agree or disagree with the intent. If I understand it, which I think I do better having talked to you. The interesting thing is you said, I wasn't thinking of, I thought I love the way you said it. Actually, it's really great. It made good sense. I read it in my head and it sounded right. And so I went with it.
It made sense in my head.
Right. I think we got to be a little bit more, give people a little more grace. Like, hey, I wasn't trying to be, a jerk. Like it made sense to me. And you may
Yes,
not
it makes sense to
agree.
me.
And folks don't have to agree.
Okay.
Please don't agree. Don't agree
Okay.
with anything I've said on here.
But don't be mean.
Right. So this is why I think at some level, what we call the culture wars, circling back to this whole topic about, trying to increase outrage about, the arts or music. I mean, don't get me started on Tipper Gore and the PMRC and all that stuff, putting labels, on. I mean, this is like,
now you're going
this was
way
my
back. I was before I was born. Go ahead.
listen. This whole, but it's like it all started there, and I'm 47, so like I guess I do go a little bit back. But what I think we don't realize is that in the early days of this stuff, I'm not sure if this is factual or not. So I'm going to go ahead and make this claim, and feel free, folks, to shred me in the comments or offer counterpoints or whatever. Be nice or don't. It actually doesn't bother me. But I actually think in the early days, what we had was a kind of class division where kind of upper crust Republicans, upper crust conservative Christians, upper crust Democrats. I mean, remember, Tipper Gore was Al Gore's wife, was the one behind the PMRC thing. And it was a joint effort. And what they were saying was, your rap music and your metal, your Ozzy Osbourne and, your Tupac and everything else, like these are bad. They've got bad words, right? We can't have, they're polluting our youth. And so it was this almost like classist thing where united at the top were the left and the right. So what happened is that evolved, and I think it got away from the original participants. And what it became is the us versus them was not about kind of elitist ideas about culture, like, well, that's not music, that's not art, that's a rosary in a jar of amber liquid. Like, that's not art. Art is the Mona Lisa. Music is Beethoven, not the Beastie Boys, right? That class thing has shifted, and it's become a partisan politics thing. So now the division is not between high culture and street culture or metal culture or what have you. It's now between my politics and your politics. I don't know enough. Like, I haven't studied this closely to look at the evolution of that, but I think what happened is one side actually got outplayed in that. And especially, and this is where it would be interesting to look at the evolution of the moral majority, the Christian coalition, like those movements that began to really kind of take on a role in these culture wars. And because they were also more politically conservative, I think what ended up happening is the politically conservative part kind of won out over the Christian part. So the Christian part was just included in that side of the spectrum as us versus them, the heathens and, beatniks on one side and the church folks on the other. I don't know. Just a thought. Yeah, we got some great folks in the comments here pointing out outrage as a business model. That's exactly what I'm talking about. I think we need to understand that more. Go ahead, Stanley.
So let's switch gears for one more second, because we're going to wrap this up in a few minutes. But I want to talk about one thing that, since we brought up the whole thing of brought up about COVID and all the different, everybody getting their vaccines. But have you noticed that since we have all come out of quote unquote COVID, that people have just been really violent? I mean, really violent. And I mean, really violent. I mean, just really violent. There seems to be a whole lot more of just mean stuff going on right now. What is going on?
I think what's going on, and I don't really know. So this isn't a definitive statement. It's just a hunch. I think we're at the beginning of the coming to a head of something that's been festering for a long time. And, you get that kind of sore red spot somewhere on your face or somewhere else. And it's just kind of a bump, and it's red and it hurts, but you can't really do anything about it until it's fully expressed, like until that festering stuff is at the surface and ready to be cleansed, if you will, right? Sorry for the vivid visual. I think we haven't taken seriously enough the cost of all this anger, all this outrage, all of this economic pressure, this idea that you're supposed to make it and get ahead, and how you're supposed to do that is go to school and get a degree, which, oh, by the way, is going to come with a massive amount of debt. That's going to put you, you're supposed to get a certain kind of a job, and you have to keep up with the Jones. Like, somewhere along the way, someone decided that this American dream, which, oh, by the way, is just is a justification for accumulation of stuff, that it had to look a particular way. It involved real estate, shopping malls, now Amazon.com, like it involved cosmetics,
Yes.
surgery, and weight loss, everything. Like, everyone's out there so disconnected from our actual humanity that we really think it's a life or death situation if we don't have six-pack abs and a Ferrari. Like, we have got this so twisted. And all of the anger and outrage and fear that has been stoked by people who are making very good money doing it on all sides of the spectrum is causing an incredible amount of stress. Having said that, there's also, so what this may sound a little bit weird, but it's something I've been thinking about. I don't have a very clear way of expressing it yet. Oftentimes in direct care, mental health, and other types of direct care, right? You'll hear the phrase trauma-informed care, right? In other words, trying to take into account, having a framework for understanding the person who is dealing with stuff, goodly, badly, everything in betweenly, that is informed by a trauma perspective. I think we need a trauma-informed perspective on humanity, because we all been through some stuff out here. Wars, violence, racism, economic disparity, like diseases, everything, right? And I think we need to find our way towards an appreciation of our humanity in all of this. It's amazing.
Okay.
One of my former professors, who then became a colleague at Berkeley, who then has moved on, John Marks, has this wonderful, he's a biological anthropologist who actually studies genetics and human evolution and things of that nature. He had a wonderful way of putting this, which is, when it comes to really what makes us similar or different, we don't have a clue. Like, we don't understand genetics at all in the common way that we talk about things. We think racial categories, for example, are physical realities, like that there's actually a this race and a that race. And the biologists will tell you that's simply not true. These are linguistic constructs. You and I, Stanley, we look very different from each other in a number of different ways. And if we were to take a certain kind of genetic test, we might find out that you and I have more in common genetically than two chimpanzees that look like identical twins. Like, we're so confused out here about the actual reality of difference and sameness.
Where's your family come from originally?
Earth? Like,
okay. What part of the
no, but I have to say it like that, because otherwise, what do you think? That nation states are the primary category for identity, or that?
Well, no, I did the DNA test, and I came from Scotland.
Yeah, perfect.
Imagine that.
I haven't done the DNA test, but the first McIntyre, I did trace my family's history a number of years ago. The first McIntyre in my family came here from Scotland in 1795. We're related. And by the way, you only get you only get this idea that my family's from Scotland if you ignore all the women that the McIntyres married all along the way.
Right.
Because we're as much from Norway as we are from Scotland. All right. So, responding to the chat about identity politics. No, I wanted you to understand something about this. I'm not saying identity politics are the answer. I'm saying identity politics are the problem, because we are so confused. We think those categories have actual validity. Now, at the same time as I say that, I'm going to say something else controversial. I don't think identity politics have any merit in reality, but they do have a merit in language. And for humans,
Okay.
language is what we call reality. So I think if someone's identity matters to them, let them have it. Who cares? Like, literally, who cares? If you think this is the right bathroom for you to use or that's the right bathroom for you to use, great. You got to pee. Go pee. I don't care. We've gotten ourselves so caught up in adding stakes to these claims. So where's my family from originally? Earth. So's yours.
Okay.
You and I have more in common than a pigeon and a dove that look almost identical. So now what? I'm just kind of
you went off. That's fine. So here's my question I ask almost everybody I talk to. I firmly believe that somewhere out in space, maybe it's hidden behind the back of the moon, there's a huge billboard that's telling everybody flying by to avoid this big blue ball because we're all a bunch of nutcases here.
Yes. We were joking before. It's like if Earth was for sale, you would see it like on Craigslist or OfferUp or something, and it would be like listed 47,000 years ago and like no buyers. It's just like sitting there. It's like the price keeps coming down. Like, well, what about this? What about that? Here's the way I would summarize this, and it sounds a little bit odd, but it works for me. So hey, I am what I would call an anti-humanist humanitarian. What do I mean by that? Anti-humanist means I don't think human beings are all that special. I don't think we are the most superior expression of anything, and whether it's William Shakespeare or Will.i.am, I think that language is great, music is cool, but from Tolstoy to Tupac, whatever, like we're just not that special. We are another form of life on this rock spinning through space in the middle of nowhere. Humanitarian, because I think, hey, you know what? We are here together. We might as well not make each other so damn miserable. What about that? Like, we're here. We're not important, but we are making each other miserable. Let's stop. Not because there's any higher logic to it. And religious folks will have a different view of this altogether because they will have a story of their own significance that's very different than mine. Cool.
Everybody's more important than everybody else.
Let's just not make each other so miserable. How about that?
Well, I mean, okay, so that's easier said than done because the minute you go and you live out here in Phoenix, so you already know that can't nobody drive for Jack. So you think you're better because you're a better driver. That's automatic. You're going to be like, I don't know why these people driving the car. I'm better than they are. They can't drive for Jack. So there's going to be this level of superiority, whether it's mentally or something. Even in the grocery store, there's a level of hierarchy of what you buy from the grocery store. If you're buying all liquor or if you're buying all that or you're doing all this. So
whether your beer is 32 ounces or 40, that was a brilliant
40 ounces, exactly.
Insight. If you're buying a 40, it means one thing. If you're buying 32 ounces, it means something else.
Yeah. I brought 6 40-ounce bottles of Old English one day, had them in one of those carts you get from the grocery store. And somebody said to me, oh, you plan on having a party, huh? And you know what I said to him? I said, no, I'm cooking crab. Oh, they already had an idea that I was having this big 40-ounce party at the house. They were going to find weed, a bunch of half-naked women. That was all just for me getting the beer.
That was the night before. Now you were having the crab.
Right, now I'm just having crab, which Dungeon is crab. So now it went from hardcore party with a bunch of gangbangers to a bunch of elitists drinking beer and, and talking about stock market and cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
Just in that split second. But you know what, ladies and gentlemen, this is Adrian McIntyre. He is a cultural anthropologist. We sat down here. We just had a long talk about everything that we should have talked about and some stuff that we didn't talk about. And we have to come back and do this again because, Adrian, you used some words I got to go back and look up now. I wrote them all down. I'm like, what does that mean? So that was above my pay grade. But you have a PhD. But then again, so do I.
Yes. Tell us about your PhD.
It's called a plain high school. It costs a whole lot less than
I learned something new today. It does, and it's worth the same amount. That's the thing. Sir. It's worth the same.
Yeah.
In real life. Well, this was a pleasure. listen, all I can say out there is let's not make each other so miserable, and deal with our own problems. Try to care for ourselves and each other. You may think that sounds like hippy dibby liberal BS, but I promise you, being treated nice is all right. We ought to do that to each other more often.
I love that slogan. We should make that like running for office. Being nice is all right.
It's kind of like
almost like the billboard that says "Vote for anybody with a sensible mind."
any functioning adult, 2024.
That's it.
It's like the Rufus character from Bill and Ted's, which was filmed here in the Valley. Neither you or I are from here, but here we are. But yeah, no, they filmed outside the Circle K in Tempe. Was that whole like be excellent to one another? That's about as good as a philosophy as I can think of.
Yeah, be excellent. And just think of it like that movie with what's the guy's name? He was an actor. Anyways, where there was a future and they didn't touch hands anymore. They just went like this and be well. So
I don't think I know that one.
That movie was made for the pandemic.
Right.
Demolition Man.
Okay, I didn't see it.
But you don't touch hands anymore and use the 3 seashells.
Sounds good. We've certainly done it all kinds of ways, and we're going to do it all kinds of other ways. This was delightful, Stanley. Thank you.
I really enjoyed our conversation. I do appreciate it, and thank you so much for dropping in. And we got to do this again, and maybe we should do it in studio so that we're not at the victim of
Cox Communications.
Cox. Yeah. I had a name for that, but I won't say it on here because I will get banned from the internet if I use what I was going to say. But I want to thank you.
The audience is smart. They can figure it out themselves.
Yeah, exactly. You have a good day, sir.
Same to you.
So thank you guys for joining us. Adrian was, it was great to hear him talk about some things. And again, I got to go back and look up some of those words. And if you're like me, you got to too. You know that we base our podcast on your help. We appreciate it when you hit us up on social media and tell us how much you enjoyed the podcast. We also want you to share it. But remember, these podcasts are only work if you help. And we use viewer donations. And it's funny thing is people go, viewer donations? Why would you ask for that? Well, PBS has been asking for viewer donations their entire life. And so now we're just trying to do the same model. We want to make sure we want to keep this going. And we can have great guests like Adrian. And also, one more thing I want to tell you, we have an exclusive coming up. And that's going to be with Alameda County Sheriff. He's going to sit down with us and pretty soon, and we're going to have a one-on-one conversation exclusively on reasons why aliens would ever invade Earth. I want to thank you guys again for joining in, and we'll find this on our